Episode 4, Rule Britannia. Hello and welcome back to 202 Decades. Last time we watched as Emperor Tiberius, still isolated on his island retreat, finally became aware of Sejanus' scheming. Tiberius began to plot how to bring Sejanus down. At the cusp of highest power, Sejanus was taken unaware, accused, convicted, strangled, and thrown down the Gemonian stairs as the crowds of Rome shouted. Free of Sejanus, Tiberius was now left alone with his paranoia. In 37 AD, the old Tiberius finally died, perhaps with the kind help of a pillow applied to his face by Gaius. This Gaius was the son of Germanicus, and is remembered today as Caligula. After years of enduring the old boar Tiberius, the reign of Gaius started off with a bang. Feasting, festivals, and public games were back. But then they just kept on going as the treasury was drained in irresponsible spending. Caligula had put on a good face when first meeting with the Senate and talked a big game about restoring the relationship between the princeps and the Senate to how Augustus had done things. It soon became apparent, however, that Caligula was sadistic and cruel. He had begun to humiliate the Senate, making them bow down before him, kiss his feet, or run beside his chariot. Suetonius says he even began to make his horse consul for the year, because the horse had more sense than any of them. At parties, he would disappear with senators' wives, and then return and describe in detail the things he had subjected the woman to. And of course, any hint of outrage or resistance would be met with a swift execution. This wasn't limited to parties, though. Either to bring in funds or because he liked their property, senators and wealthy equestrians were tried and executed on trumped-up charges, and their property was seized by Caligula. As the treasury ran dry, Caligula's seizure of property and his new taxes kept the extravagance going. Naturally, plots began to form against his life. When rumors reached him of plots, he leaned harder into his trials and executions. We left Caligula last time as he journeyed to the Rhine frontier. I failed to mention some of his escapades there. When he wasn't busy executing the well-liked governor, he was proving himself a true imperator, all with his own special twist, of course. While his army marched from Rome to the frontier, he was carried on a litter held up by 8 men. He crossed the Rhine River with his soldiers, and they promptly set up a lunch tent for him and his companions. While they were eating, a servant rushed in, shouting that there were enemy Germans in the area. Our brave Caligula did not flinch. He quickly gathered his nobles and the Praetorian cavalry and charged out at the enemy. He and his companions returned as heroes, with tree branches in hand to underline their daring. Of course, the Germans who had been sighted were some of his own bodyguard, who had been sent into the wood for the very purpose of causing a commotion. Caligula had been in on it the whole time. But are you going to tell the mad emperor he wasn't really such a lion-hearted warrior? The Senate would need to know of his heroism too. So Caligula sent a letter to them, rebuking their absence, saying, "While Caesar was fighting and exposed to such dangers, they were indulging in revels and in frequenting the theaters and their pleasant villas." When Caligula grew tired of the Rhine frontier, he marched his soldiers to the shore of the North Sea, for what they had been told was an expedition to Britannia. The coasts of Gaul were frequently attacked by pirates or raiders from across the English Channel, so it would be plenty believable to be dealing with this threat. I'm not sure Caligula's execution did much to help, though. The legions were lined up in battle formation, with even the ballistas facing the sea. The soldiers must have been looking to the horizon, expecting transport ships to pick them up. Suddenly, Caligula commanded them to gather seashells in their helmets and gowns. They were commanded to bring them back to Rome as spoils from the ocean, due to the capital and Palatine. His soldiers returned to Rome with their shells, and Caligula returned with a triumph thrown for him to celebrate his great victories. Yes, the ones I just described, those great victories. He actually did accomplish an expansion of the empire during his short reign, but not through collecting seashells. On the southwest coast of the Mediterranean Sea, in modern Algeria and Morocco, was the client kingdom of Mauritania. This was a wealthy kingdom led by King Ptolemy, the son of Juba, and the grandson of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Yes, that Mark Antony and that Cleopatra. I'm consistently surprised by how small the family ties make the Roman world feel, especially up at the top. For example, this Ptolemy was a not-so-distant cousin of Caligula, because Caligula was also a great-grandson of Mark Antony. Ptolemy was a loyal client king to the Romans, and their relationship had been mutually beneficial. In 17 AD, when the nomadic Berbers in his kingdom revolted, he had relied on help from the Roman governor of Africa, just to the east in modern Tunisia. Together, over 7 years, they had put down the revolt and restored peace. At some point between then and 40 AD, a senator went to Ptolemy and greeted him as king, ally, and friend, and gave him a gift of an ivory scepter. In 40 AD, Ptolemy was invited to Rome, and he was received by Caligula with honors. According to Suetonius, Ptolemy and Caligula attended a gladiatorial show together. Caligula took envious note of the attention Ptolemy was receiving from the crowds who were admiring his royal purple cloak. After the show, Caligula suddenly ordered Ptolemy be executed. Like most everything recorded by the ancient historians, modern historians question the alleged motive and suggest Caligula may have been wanting to expand control over Mauritania. Others suggest that before his execution, the governor Gaetulicus, who Caligula had executed along the Rhine, had implicated Ptolemy in a plot against him. Whatever the cause, executing the king was short-sighted, and it tipped Mauritania into instability. While Rome would officially annex the territory, it would not establish real control for years. A household slave of Ptolemy, who was of Berber origin, gathered the disaffected Berbers and began a new revolt that would ravage the region. Caligula's cruelty eventually caught up with him. When he announced he would be moving to Alexandria, where he could personally be worshipped as a god, his conspirators must have realized now was the time to strike. One of those most eager to end Caligula was a man named Caligula. He was a member of the Praetorian Guard and had been for decades now. According to Tacitus, he had served under Caligula's father, Germanicus, during his campaigns in Germania. This means his face was probably familiar to Caligula since childhood. Neither his tenure nor his familiarity kept Caligula from mocking him relentlessly, making fun of his voice and his supposed femininity. The passwords Caligula gave to him were consistently degrading. By January of 41, Caligula had had enough. When he expressed his frustration, he was met with similar stories from others and found a large number of senators, equestrians, and Praetorians ready to lend him their support. Caligula was to attend games held for the divine Augustus, and while he was walking through a corridor, Caligula and his co-conspirators jumped out and began to stab the mad emperor. He was dead before his German bodyguard could react. The fear that people in the Senate had lived under made them hesitant to believe the reports. Was this just a test? Caligula was surely playing some sick joke on them to test their loyalty. But no, he was really dead. Their eagerness to kill him was so strong that the conspirators had never bothered planning a succession. The Senate then met quickly to decide what came next. They had suffered under humiliation and tyranny for 3 years. There was no clear successor in place. A few voices began to rise, advocating a return to the Republic, back to the way things had been before the princeps or the triumvirates. Their ancient ancestors had overthrown the Roman kings and established a republic. Perhaps they could too. It was time for a return to liberty. While the Senate debated on what to do next, another arm of power was taking action. The Praetorian Guard were making their way through the city, killing anyone associated with Caligula, including his wife and daughter. I've so far made no connections with last episode's portion on Judea, but here history does us a favor and makes the connection easy. One group of Praetorians was being led by Herod Agrippa, a grandson of Herod the Great, who would become a prominent personality among the elite in Rome. As this squad, led by Herod Agrippa, passed through one of the residences, one of the guard heard something and found Caligula's uncle, Claudius, hiding behind a curtain. Claudius and Herod Agrippa were childhood friends, so instead of killing him, Herod convinced the guard to hail him as emperor. The guard was more than happy to choose Claudius. They would need a patron, and who would be more malleable to their wishes than the awkward and cowardly Claudius? They gathered more of their comrades and rushed to the Senate building. The debate was still raging when Claudius was brought in, surrounded by armed guards. Talk of ending the Principate dried up at the sight of the Praetorians. If Dio and Josephus are to be believed, it was Herod Agrippa who convinced the Senate to drop the idea of restoring the Republic, as he gently reminded the Senate, many of whom he knew well, that they were surrounded by the Guard, and their enthusiastic support for Claudius was strongly encouraged. So, Claudius was hailed as Princeps. But who was this guy? Born in 10 BC, Claudius was the younger brother of Germanicus. A year after his birth, their father, Drusus, fell off his horse and died. With all the political purges and intrigue that had transpired since Germanicus died, it's surprising that Claudius has so far flown under the radar of both the purges and our own story. There's a simple explanation, though. At a young age, Claudius developed a limp and a degree of deafness and was resented by his mother, Antonia, for his disability. She referred to him as a monster, and before long pawned him off to her own mother, Livia, the wife of Augustus. Livia was hard on Claudius, and assigned his formation to a disciplinarian who blamed his disabilities on laziness and a lack of willpower. As he matured, or as he learned to work with his conditions, his symptoms became less severe. As a 17-year-old, the famous author and historian Livy was assigned to tutor him. Despite his awkwardness, he was clearly very intelligent, and like his tutor, he began to write histories. When he wrote a history of the Civil Wars, he apparently explained things a little too honestly regarding his adopted grandfather, instead of towing the party line. Augustus was always cultivating his image through propaganda, depicting him as a defender of the Republic, rather than an instigator of its downfall. So when Claudius's work was reviewed and found to be the brutal truth, Augustus reprimanded him, had the work destroyed, and while he had been rising a bit in esteem, this misstep led him to be removed from consideration for any official position for years. So Claudius lived his life in private, which was a great place to be during the purges of Sejanus and Tiberius. He kept in correspondence with many prominent intellectuals during this time, including Pliny the Elder. And like anyone who takes up the writing of history out of pure interest, Claudius was a nerd. He published 2 lengthy histories of first the Etruscans, who were considered cool at the time, and second the Carthaginians. Both works were considered excellent by his contemporaries, but like far too many works, they've been lost to the centuries. Intriguingly, he also proposed the addition of 3 new letters to the Latin alphabet. As emperor, he officially promoted their use, and inscriptions from his reign still bear the characters. These were dropped even more quickly than his histories, though. When Tiberius finally passed away, Caligula took power, and as a bit of an outsider to politics, Caligula wanted to remind the Roman people of his pedigree by highlighting another close relative of the beloved Germanicus. Claudius, Germanicus' brother, was made co-consul with Caligula in 37 AD. Claudius finally had a prominent public position, but being close to Caligula was a dangerous game. Claudius was tormented relentlessly by his nephew, humiliating him in public, teasing him for his disabilities, and charging him huge sums of money. By 41 AD, before Caligula's death, Claudius had become sickly and thin, probably from the stress. No wonder, then, that many think he helped orchestrate the plot to assassinate Caligula. That it was his friend Herod Agrippa who found him and proclaimed him emperor seems a little bit prearranged. Whatever the truth, as the new princeps, Claudius inherited an empire teetering on the brink of a generalized disaster. The treasury was empty, Mauritania was in revolt, and Judea was on the brink. He may have been the highest authority in the land, but his hold on power was tenuous. He had been placed in his position not by succession, nor the will of the people, nor the Senate, but by the brute force of the Praetorians. Claudius may have been bookish and awkward, but the start of his reign looked a lot like tyranny. So Claudius had to act skillfully and carefully to hold together the peace and hold off his challengers. He set about becoming popular fast. First, he gave a nice bonus to the Praetorians, and a bonus to the army as well. Gotta keep them on your side. Outside of the military, he abolished the ridiculous taxes imposed by Caligula, which in general is a great way to win the favor of the people. He ended the inquisitions and phony trials began by Caligula, and even promised to spare the conspirators who killed Caligula, with the exception of Caria, of course. Can't have an assassin walking the streets. And he ended the humiliating practices Caligula had imposed on the Senate. No more prostration or kissing his feet. Without the strain of these weights that had been placed on them by his predecessor, Claudius's rule must have felt like liberty after all. But this liberty was one where burdens were removed from the Senate, rather than responsibility returned to them. These concessions made relations easier with most, but plots were still afoot. If you can be placed in power by a violent coup, you can be removed in just the same manner. There were few men in high positions Claudius could trust, but he needed help holding things together. Unlike his predecessor, in Tiberius near the end, Claudius actually cared about governing well. So, to multiply his abilities, he appointed several former slaves, freedmen, to high positions and allowed them to take some of the weight of governing. He wasn't the first princeps to rely on freedmen, but he gave them higher degrees of influence than any before. Chief among the freedmen were Narcissus, Pallas, Callistus, and Polybius. If you're going to remember one of these names, remember Narcissus. These freedmen were direct representatives of Claudius and could speak on his behalf. This might sound a little close to the situation between Tiberius and Sejanus from the prior 2 decades, where their influence over him meant essentially that they were the ones ruling. That is the accusation made against Claudius by the ancient historians, who seem to never be able to give the poor guy credit. It's true, though, that although these freedmen administered well, they weren't above corruption. Finding the treasury in cobwebs, Pallas, the secretary of the treasury, went to work filling it back up. At the same time, he was able to skim the fat off the top, and he became extremely wealthy, making millions. The other freedmen quickly became rather well off too, much to the chagrin of the highborn Senate, forced to watch former slaves rise above them in wealth and influence. Under the guidance of his freeman secretaries, or on his own initiative, or in some kind of collaboration, Claudius went about enriching and expanding the empire. He began many massive building projects and completed others. A new channel was dug to protect Rome from flooding of the Tiber River. A massive harbor was built near Rome's port of Ostia, making receiving grain shipments easier to feed the immense and hungering city of Rome with its 1 million residents. These projects kept the public happy, but the elite still didn't trust Claudius. He never had the charisma to easily gain admirers. He would have to work for it and prove his glory. To achieve this, he began to do something explicitly against the instructions of the great Augustus: expanding the empire. The conquest of Britain is his most famous achievement, and we'll get to that shortly, but many other regions were brought into the empire at this time. The region of Lycia in southern Anatolia, which had been granted nominal independence as an ally 2 centuries earlier, was now incorporated due to instability there. After a difficult war with the Berbers, Mauritania was finally pacified and integrated as 2 Roman provinces. I mistakenly said in the final prologue episode that the capture of Egypt made the Roman Empire expand all the way around the Mediterranean, but I neglected the coast of Algeria and Morocco. Now though, with the takeover of Mauritania, the Mediterranean really was a Roman lake. Similarly, Thrace had long been another kingdom allied to Rome, but not officially incorporated. In 46, the king of the country died, and seeing an opportunity for more independence, some of the elite began an anti-Roman revolt. Probably not the best idea. The country was quickly captured and now integrated as a Roman province. Add to the list Noricum in what's now Austria, which had been ruled by a client kingdom. It was also incorporated as a province under Claudius. And finally, Claudius reversed the status of Judea and shifted it from a full Roman province back to a client kingdom, under the rule of his friend Herod Agrippa, who was made king in 42 AD. Herod Agrippa became king not just of the reduced Judea, but of Galilee and Perea as well. Besides repaying his friend, Claudius must have seen the instability in the region and wanted a local, though a thoroughly Romanized one, in charge. The return of Herodian rule didn't last long, though. In 44 AD, Herod died suddenly, shortly after appearing at festivities where he was dressed in such fine clothing that the mostly pagan audience began to declare him a god. Despite his Jewish heritage, Herod made no protests. In the biblical account from the Acts of the Apostles, he was struck down for his hubris. Some historians speculate he was poisoned due to tensions with the governor of Syria. Following his death, his kingdom was reabsorbed as a Roman province, which was not popular with the Jews. Regardless, we can count that as another expansion of Roman power. Altogether, that's some nice expansion and consolidation, Claudius. But the most prized conquest was of Britain. As you may have noticed, Britain lies across the English Channel from northern France or Gaul. Information about the island was not absent from the Roman world, but its distance from Italy and its position across the sea gave it a mythical reputation. Britain had long been connected to the wider world. As early as the Bronze Age, it was a major source for tin for the rest of Europe, and the Phoenicians may have been involved with trade there. In the 50s BC, while Julius Caesar campaigned across Gaul, he actually visited the island. With its Celtic tribes connected to the Celtic tribes in Gaul, Caesar went there to stop them from aiding his enemies in Gaul. While he didn't make any lasting conquests or garrisons there, he received the submissions of several Celtic kings. Over the next century, southern Britain remained in close contact with Roman Gaul, with extensive trade and movement between the two. Events on the British side of the Channel weren't static, though. 2 powerful tribes in the south of the island began to clash, with one side, the Caduvellauni, making significant gains on the other's territory. The defeated tribe was a friend of Rome. The Caduvellauni were not, and soon began to attack other nearby pro-Roman tribes. Verica, the king of the defeated tribe, fled across the Channel and sought refuge in Rome. Verica was met with a surprisingly receptive response by the imperial messengers. Claudius was still looking for an opportunity to prove himself worthy of being the top man in Rome. Something bigger than nibbling up the client kingdoms on the periphery of the empire. What better way to prove himself than to conquer a far-off land that even Caesar had not conquered? So Claudius used the exiled Verica's claim as an excuse for his invasion. Massive preparations got underway in northern Gaul to transport the necessary troops over to the island. An army was assembled, mostly from the same forces that had been brought there by Caligula a few years earlier. That expedition, that I mentioned earlier in this episode, is thought to have been an aborted plan to invade Britain by Caligula. Well, now the soldiers could see that this campaign was for real, and some of them didn't like that. There must have been legends about the terrible things on the island. Discord began to grow among the soldiers, and it seems there were threats of mutiny to call off the expedition. Only with the prodding of Narcissus, who was there overseeing preparations, did the troops finally agree to board the boats. Supposedly, they laughed when they saw this freedman telling them what to do. Hey, it worked, I guess. So in 43 AD, the Roman fleet crossed the English Channel and landed in the southeast of Britain. They would have seen the white cliffs of Dover emerge through the mists before they landed. Exactly where that was isn't clear. 4 legions, the 2nd, 9th, 14th, and 20th, disembarked from the ships along with auxiliary soldiers, altogether making up a force of around 40,000 men, led by a general named Aulus Claudius. Word had slipped across the channel of the coming invasion, and the Britons were ready with a large army to stop the Roman advance. Skirmishes took place as the Romans moved north. At the river Medway in Kent, the Britons had gathered with their full army, led by Caradicus and Togodumnus, sons of the king of the Caduvalauni. Their army was lined up facing across the river, daring the Romans to try to cross the bridgeless water. A force of auxiliaries from modern Belgium swam in secret across the river and began to harass the Britons' cavalry and chariots. During the chaos those troops caused, the main legions began to march across the river in their full armor, and somehow they were able to gain a foothold on the far shore. But the fighting was intense. The Battle of the Medway was about as tough as it got for the Romans when facing up against barbarians on an open field. Fighting continued throughout the day and into a second day of battle. But in the end, the Romans wore out their opponents, and the brave Britons finally had to retreat. Togodumnus and Caradicus led their forces back north and west, attempting to use the River Thames as their new barrier, but the Romans pursued quickly. The initial crossing by the Romans, near modern London, sent the British resistance fleeing further now, back to defend their main base of operations at Camulodunum, modern Colchester. Rather than going in for the kill, Aulus Claudius sent word to stall the advance now. A pre-arranged letter was sent back across the channel, stating that only the presence of the emperor himself would allow the expedition to succeed. Hardly true, but the emperor needed to be present for the killing blow. Claudius, waiting on this notice, boarded his transport ship and crossed the English Channel, arriving just a few days after being summoned. During these days, Togodumnus died, perhaps from wounds he suffered during the Battle of the Medway. Caradicus alone led the resistance. Claudius disembarked and stepped foot upon Britain. If this was all about public image, Claudius made sure to tailor it as much as possible and pulled out the big guns. He triumphantly rode into the army base, not atop a horse, but atop a war elephant. Cassius Dio makes sure to mention this. He had brought over several of the beasts for the campaign, and these were probably the first elephants to step foot in Great Britain since the mammoths. The prestige of military victory was why Claudius had come so far. So now that he had arrived, the assault on Camulodunum could commence. Cassius Dio says, Claudius crossed over to Britain, where he joined the legions that were waiting for him near the Thames. Taking over the command of these, he crossed the stream, and engaging the barbarians who had gathered at his approach, he defeated them and captured Camulodunum. Claudius led the march, or at least made a show of doing so. He probably was in little real danger. The resistance by this point was broken, and when Claudius reached the town, Camulodunum was easily taken. 11 tribes kneeled and submitted themselves to Roman control. Claudius stuck around on the island for only 16 days before heading back to Rome. He had his victory and would receive a huge triumph for his conquests. The ends of the earth were coming under Roman control, thanks to Claudius. The real work of conquest had just begun, though. Back in Britain, Aulus Claudius, who had been appointed the first governor of the new Roman province of Britannia, set about expanding the foothold they had captured and consolidating Roman rule. Camulodunum had been conquered, but Caradicus had fled and escaped far to the west in modern Wales, where he now began to gather supporters for further resistance. At this point, the Romans controlled only a tiny slice of the island, around Kent and Essex. The army was now split into 3 sections, the first heading north to Lincoln, the second heading northwest to the Midlands, and the last heading south and west parallel to the southern coast of England, as far as Exeter. The commander of this 3rd division should be noted. His name was Vespasian, and he will play a key role in our story in a couple of decades. He and his colleagues, who were fanning out across the country, still had their work cut out for them. The fractious nature of the Celtic tribes in Britain meant there wasn't one knockout blow they could take to subdue the whole country. Instead, they had to defeat tribe after tribe and capture hill fort after hill fort. These hill forts were called oppidum, and they served as defensible fortified towns, or marketplaces, where people of a tribe could gather. Vespasian, on his campaign westward, had to methodically besiege and capture dozens of these oppida. These marches, fanning across the country, took several years, but by 47, most of the lowlands of the southeast of Britain had been conquered. At the edge, running from southwest to northeast, a road was constructed, called the Fosse Way, to facilitate communication on the frontier. Of course, inside the Roman control area, many roads were built as well. Public works such as these facilitated trade and changed settlement patterns. A significant settlement began to grow at one of the important crossroads in the country, where the Romans had built a bridge across the Thames. Here, at this crossing, a settlement called Londinium began to grow. It would take a few years for the provincial administration to move from Camulodunum to here, but this small crossroads marked the beginning of the city of London. In 46 AD, Aulus Claudius retired back to Rome, where he received an ovation for his successful work. His replacement was named Publius Ostorius Scapula. Faced with some small revolts, Scapula set about trying to disarm all the Britons in the Roman-controlled third of Britannia. The plan massively backfired, as it affected not only conquered tribes, but also allied client tribes. One such tribe was the Iceni from Norfolk. They would not stand by, bearing the dishonor of being disarmed, and they revolted, bringing several of their neighbors into revolt with them. Though they were defeated, their grievances simmered. Scapula now turned his attention to what is now Wales. The old enemy Caradicus had fled here and was still making trouble for the Romans and building anti-Roman coalitions. He had gathered a large following. The tribes here were more remote and had never had anything to do with Rome before the invasion. Things came to a head in a last battle against Caradicus at a site of his choosing called Caer Caradoc, near the modern border between England and Wales. A series of low stone walls stood between the two armies. As the battle began, the Britons bombarded the Romans with a heavy rain of arrows. This slowed the Roman advance, but their heavy shields and armor were more than enough to stop the barrage. The legions formed up into a testudo formation, forming a square with shields facing out and above to block any projectiles. They were able to slowly march forward in this defensive formation and began to tear down the stone walls between them. With these out of the way, the Roman army could advance more quickly. When they reached the Britons, it quickly became a slaughter. The Romans had won again. Still, Caradicus wouldn't be captured. He weaseled his way out of another defeat, and this time fled north of Roman control. His luck ran out here, though, as he had lost all his mystique and prestige after this final defeat. The queen of the tribe he went to took him captive and delivered him to the Romans to win their favor. His resistance was over. Caradicus had finally been captured, and he was taken as a prisoner to Rome. He was paraded before the crowds. It would have been customary to execute him, especially for an enemy as troublesome as he had been. But according to Tacitus, he gave a speech that saved his life. "My present lot is as glorious to you as it is degrading to myself. I had men and horses, arms and wealth. What wonder if I parted with them reluctantly? If you Romans choose to lord it over the world, does it follow that the world is to accept slavery? Were I to have been at once delivered up as a prisoner, neither my fall nor your triumph would have become famous. My punishment would be followed by oblivion, whereas if you save my life, I shall be an everlasting memorial of your clemency." Claudius granted him a pardon. He would serve as a reminder to the people of the city of Claudius's great conquest. Of course, we're not sure if the story is authentic. Tacitus has a habit of putting his own views in the mouths of barbarians. It's nice to think, though, that Caradicus and his family lived the rest of their lives in Rome. We have to ask here why the Romans bothered with the conquest of Britain. On paper, it seems to fall into the same problems the Romans had faced in Germania that ultimately led to them abandoning conquest there. Britain wasn't wealthy, it was divided into many small tribes, and it was remote. So why was Britain conquered while Germania was abandoned? The first reason is ambition. As I've hopefully made clear, Claudius's position at the top was tenuous, and he needed military glory to shore up his rule. His brother Germanicus had campaigned in Germania, but he would go to an even more remote area. The foreignness of the island and its almost mythical reputation lent prestige to the conquest. Claudius was showing that he could put himself in the shoes of Julius Caesar and conquer a whole new area for the empire. It certainly is impressive that the Romans were able to gather 4 legions and transports and supplies and sail them across the dangerous English Channel and conquer the southeast of Britain. Claudius may not have been in the same caliber of general or leader as Caesar had been, but his will allowed the campaign to come together and succeed. Another reason for success in Britain is its similarity to Gaul, culturally. Both societies were Celtic, and there was little difference in a tribe on one side of the channel from the other at this time. Many of the tribes closer to Gaul were already somewhat Romanized and had been in contact with Rome for nearly a century at this point, which made change smoother. With their experience conquering Gaul, the Romans knew how to conquer these people through exploiting divisions, rewarding alliances, and sheer military control. To be clear, many of these conditions had also been present and still were present in Germania, with several tribes finding it favorable to befriend the Romans, and conquering either one, Germania or Britain, would make Gaul safer from raids, either across the Rhine or across the Channel. One key for continued Roman control of the island is that there was no major military disaster on the scale of Varus's disaster in the Teutoburg Forest. If Caradicus had taken a page out of Arminius's playbook and used an ambush rather than set-piece battles, events may have gone differently. If you imagine a scenario in which Caradicus ambushes the Romans and destroys 3 of their legions in the early years of the invasion, and then destroys centers of Roman occupation in the southeast, I think you could make a case of Britain being abandoned just as Germania had been. But Caradicus wouldn't have had the dense forests to help him in such an ambush. And that brings us to natural resources as an explanation for the Roman conquest. Aside from a motive of Roman glory, Britain offered many benefits that a region like Germania didn't. Rather than dense forests, Britain at this time, especially in the south, was covered in rich farmlands, not unlike much of Gaul. Cattle were a particular specialty in the area. Aside from agriculture, Britain had for long ages been a significant source of metals for Europe and the Mediterranean. As early as the Bronze Age, traders had come from the Mediterranean for Britain's significant tin deposits, essential for the production of bronze. Salt and lead were also mined here. These mineral resources made the continued Roman occupation of Britain financially successful, whereas Germania, at least at the time, didn't offer such a bounty of easily accessible resources. So Britain was conquered out of a need for military glory and was worthwhile thanks to its resources. Much of the island of Britain would be under Roman control for over 300 years. Occupation began in the southeast, but over time expanded to the north, toward the modern border of England and Scotland. Roman colonies were created on the island, and retired soldiers were settled there. The country became a thoroughly Roman place. With that, we'll look away from Britain for the moment. One of Claudius's actions during his decade was an expansion of citizenship. During the early Republic, being a citizen of Rome had originally been limited to those literally from Rome. But ever since the social wars of the late Republic, citizenship rights had expanded to wider circles outside the city. In the aftermath of the social wars, citizenship had been expanded to the whole Italian peninsula. Under Caesar and Augustus, citizenship was granted to many in Hispania and southern Gaul. It's not clear to me when exactly citizenship was granted to the residents of Greece or Anatolia. It likely was piecemeal, with citizenship granted to residents of Roman colonies in those places, before the general population. What Claudius did was expand citizenship to several loyal tribes within Gaul, even allowing the nobles of these tribes admittance to the Senate. Claudius made heavy use of his powers as censor and revised the list of senators several times. With his hold tenuous and his ambitions large, Claudius needed to appoint senators who were loyal. Another of his acts as censor was to hold a census in 48 AD. His census found 5,984,072 adult male citizens in the empire, which is about 1 million more than the census under Augustus had found. Not all of this growth was natural. As I just mentioned, citizenship had been expanded to many non-Romans since the prior census. Given these numbers and other analyses of population, a very broad guess of the total population of the empire can be made for this period. There were likely between 45 and 50 million people within the bounds of the empire. Next time, we will begin with our lens zoomed in on Claudius and find out if he was really as much of a pushover as our sources make him out to be. We will meet two potential heirs, one the son of Claudius, who had received the title Britannicus after his father's conquests, and the other simply known as Nero. Then we will zoom out a little bit, as we have reached the midpoint of the century. We will look around at the provinces and discuss what life was like there, not just for the elite, but for the average person too. Was life during the Pax Romana really as good as it has been claimed? Unfortunately, that episode may be slightly delayed in coming, as my family and I take a summer vacation. Thanks for listening. You can follow the show on Twitter at 202 Decades, or on Facebook on the 202 Decades of Western History page. See you next time.